Welcome to Finlos Loves. I'm happy to once again feature Eva, licensed therapist in Florida, as co-host. In this episode, we share a recent conversation we had about the importance of communication and maintaining healthy relationships. That conversation will be broken into segments, the first of which addresses families of origin, the tendency for some partners to lose the thread of the story of their relationship, and the experience of talking but not always being heard.
Yeah, I think we should talk about how our parents communicated too,
Why?
because it's important.
Nah.
All right. But yeah, I think since I think, if I'm conceptualizing this correctly, like the purpose of this particular part of the podcast, or like the whole Finlos Loves, like, purpose is to really discuss, how you connect. And so I think the first one we talked about the concept of decentering and what that means, and the idea of selflessness, and how it leads to deeper connection, right? When we're able to decenter ourselves and look at things from the perspective of another individual. And so I think that as we heal and we grow our ability to communicate, there's a lot of having to look back at, like, how was our communication style created. And so one of the things that I remember really early on with us is that I felt like I was always talking, and like I was like looking at you, like sort of like, okay, it's your turn. Say something.
Well, I mean, we still go through that.
Yes.
And, and it's not for want of wanting to say things, because I'm thinking and I'm feeling lots of things. And I don't know. Part of it, I think, for me is an assumption that you already know what I'm thinking and going to say anyways. And I don't want to waste your time with that. If that makes sense. And so I know myself, and based on conversations that we have about how much we dislike the idea of wasting time. And so a lot of times I think I'm kind of struggling with language. For me is a very methodical process.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very careful with how I want to represent what I'm trying to say to you. And I grow very frustrated very quickly with the impreciseness of language to match emotions and states of being. And so talking is easy. Communication is hard, because they're here, and I'm gesturing to my brain. The thoughts and the feelings are here, and the process of taking the thoughts and the feelings and the ideas and the concepts and the complex interrelationships of all of those things, converting them into a language, which is imprecise because it's symbolic, having to produce language at a very slow rate compared to how fast our brains work, knowing that you're hearing them in a second language and therefore are having to decode things twice before you're actually getting to process them. I think that the way that we have to communicate through language is really hard. And it's something that as a human, I'm actually really constantly amazed and profoundly in awe of our ability to communicate as decently as we do as people, given all of those mechanical complexities.
See, I don't think we do.
You don't think we do?
I don't think we do a great job of that at all. Where I get really frustrated at times is that there are people who like this is their first language, or this is like what you like for you, this is what you specialize in. You're an English language teacher. You spent all day decoding literary works and discussing, rhetoric devices or rhetoric devices. And so for me, it's like, okay, cool. This should be like a picnic, right? It should be, it should be a piece of cake. Nope.
No, and this is, and I don't want to get into the weeds with that too much, because a good chunk of what I do as an English teacher is reminding students that the act that we get this far at all is really impressive. And so I do an activity where we build a sentence together, and we do it one word at a time. So it's like the, and then I say, somebody give me a noun, ball, the ball. Somebody give me a verb, the ball bounces.
Is this like a Mad Lib?
Yeah, but by the time I get all the way through a class, there's 25 students, we have constructed a 25-word sentence with multiple clauses, subordinating ideas, layers of description, all in a single thought, and it's taken us 20 minutes to get there.
Mm-hmm.
But these are things that we do on the fly all the time, and it's still not accurate though, because that activity is designed. Okay, so if we're talking about like a journalist, what does a journalist see? A journalist is reporting on what they're seeing in this event, and they do their best to accurately portray the things that they saw, but they're leaving out so much information. They're leaving out the all of the other people who are there, the emotions, all of that, and so you can only convey so much through words. And I think I often struggle with the anxiety of knowing that a lot of what I want you to actually get out of what I'm saying is not communicable. It's the tingling that's in my toes right now, because like I'm really engaging in this conversation, and so like the energy in my body is really tense, and so I'm like, that you can't see is really important to conveying the sense of like.
Right, but you just told me that, so now I know. I wouldn't have known unless you had told me.
Right, but in the heat of a conversation, that information would not come out, because it's not necessarily pertinent to the topic, because we get really locked in. And honestly, sometimes what I find you and I, and I'm sure this is true of many people, we get stuck in the nuances of that one word.
I get actually angry when people do that.
Right.
Like when language becomes so nitpicky in the middle of a conversation that's not about language, to me that shows that the person's trying to detract to the usage of language rather than stay connected to what it is that they are feeling and what it is that they are trying to convey. And and that's harmful. And so I do think, you mentioned something really important, and I think that's that the idea of bringing it back to the body level of, I am feeling in this moment, I am feeling like my toes are curling, I'm feeling a tingling sensation, like that. Those are mindfulness practices that we have at our disposal to communicate, right? To communicate different information than just what we're feeling limited in communicating in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're telling me like, I don't know what's going on, but right now my hands are sweaty, and I'm like, oh, I can tell you what that means. Like that's my jam, right? Like communication is part of my jam, right? So it's like, oh, you're feeling nervous. What the hell's going on? And so that actually is a data point for me, like to be able to kind of like feel into what it is that's going on for you in the moment. And so for you in that moment, what's happening is you're experiencing reactivity, and so what we know of like human physiology and like different, and this is where it gets tricky, right? Because like we're not like physiology differs for each individual. So, but generally, like what we have in terms of data is that if you're feeling physiological stress, you're going to be less able to access parts of your frontal lobe that deal with language. So yeah, everything you're saying makes sense, actually. I can't access language. Yeah, you can't, because your body is experiencing something that's actually blocking off access to that language, because you either feel like there's a danger or that you're in trouble, or and that's why I wanted to talk about the ways that our families communicated, because a lot of that stems from like early relationships and what felt safe and didn't feel safe for us to communicate. So what was that like for you?
When I think about my family, family of birth?
Family of origin.
Family of origin. When I think of my family of origin, I'm the youngest of 5. My parents had only married after my mom got pregnant with me. So they had 4 kids before getting married. Were married for about a year and a half, and then depending on whose version of the story you hear, whatever, they separated and they got divorced. So I never got to live full time with both parents. I did intermittently, but and I'm detailing this because some of it is me grounding myself in the experience. I always was with both parents. They just didn't live together. And then there were times when they did live together, even though they were not romantically together due to financial need or because they were trying to reconcile, but it didn't work out. But for me, the fact that they weren't together was only occasionally a problem. But both of them had very similar ways of talking. They never spoke of needs. They never spoke of what I got to experience always was the emotional end of whatever was going on. So oftentimes I remember conversations that were based in anger because my mom was dealing with financial problems or she had a bad day at work or whatever. By the time she gets home, those conversations were, I don't remember very many conversations with either of my parents that were not housed in some sort of emotional state that was not at an extreme.
Mm-hmm.
So it was there were happy moments, and I'm not trying to exaggerate because I remember spending really positive times with my parents too, but they were usually amidst alcohol, and they were with people, and it was a social situation,
Like coping strategies,
right?
and
And so there were good things too, but I would not say that we were communicating in those moments. We were socializing. We were, I don't know what to call it. So for my father, I definitely had the sense that he was very much doing his best to make sure that we were independent, that we were not emotionally hindered by entangled relationships. I think.
What does that mean?
So my father, after my parents separated, my father dated occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
He was engaged once.
I see.
But he wasn't very much a romantic person. And he wasn't dating a lot, and he wasn't getting he wasn't pursuing a lot of relationships that we were aware of. I've come to learn that there were things going on, but they were very casual things that he had. So I think my father was very hurt by his strong and emotionally entangled relationships, whether they be with his parents or my mother. I think that he was hurt very much. And so I think that he was afraid of those sorts of things. And so most of the positive interactions that I can recall with my father are physical. He was very okay with me or me and my sister, or even me and my sister and my brother. Like at various times, like we were allowed to co-sleep with him whenever we wanted to. He's very physically affectionate. He likes to hug. He
Yes.
always kissed. Like it was a very physically affectionate person, but verbally, he is not a good communicator, and his communication is often in the form of warning, don't do this, or threatening,
Yes.
you're gonna, with volume, criticism,
passive aggressiveness,
belittling, shaming, all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm sure that those are learned behaviors that he had, and of course they get passed on. But and my mother, very much the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
except my mother was not very physically affectionate.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
She hugged and we were allowed to co-sleep, but she was not a warm person in that way.
I think she felt like from the little time that I knew her and what I've been, the stories that I have been told, that the way that she internalized what womanhood was is that like you basically save physical affection for like the bedroom,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah,
and in that context, yes, you're able to be physical, but like otherwise, like I don't think she understood what, you know.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that my father was, his love languages would be physical and gifts, and I think that my mother would be
Time together,
quality time and acts of service.
and acts of service. Yeah.
My mother was never a stationary person. She was cleaning, or she was working, or she was gardening, or she was doing something.
How funny that like your parents' love languages
Yeah.
are my top 3. Wow.
Physical? What you mean physical?
It's acts of service,
yeah,
physical, and time together.
So, but again, her communication was almost identical to my father's. They were fear. They were antagonistic a lot of the time. When things were good, there wasn't a lot of talking. And so maybe I have internalized that. Because if things are good, we don't have to talk about anything. There's nothing to talk about. So when quality time with my mother was sitting together on a sofa and watching a movie.
Yeah, see, my experience is like so different than that. Like it's for me, the quiet was always associated more with time with my parents, where children were there's that idea that you, how do you say that in English? It's like children are to be seen and not to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was very much like we would get a threatening talking to every time we went anywhere. And it was not like I like to have that pep talk with the kids too before we go places. But it's more of like, hey, this is the situation. Like I like people to know what they're walking into, right? So I don't mind being the person who's like, we're going to a museum, and in a museum, in this type of museum, people are going to be looking at art and they're going to want to sit quietly with the art. Or hey, we're heading to like the zoo, it's outside, be as loud as you want to. Whatever the situation is, like I like the kids to know what they're walking into, because that's kind of the way that I wish my parents would have communicated to me. But instead, what we would get is we would get like a stern talking to, which basically what was communicated to us was that we were not allowed to talk. And if we did, we were going to get in trouble. And a large part of that had to do with the fact that there was so much abuse and bad stuff going on at home that I think there was a real fear that if we talked, we were going to be disclosing information that that my parents didn't really want out there at the time. And so where in contrast, I spent, like, we talk about when we talk about ACEs, right? So adverse childhood experiences, like we know we have a lot of information about like how trauma affects children from, but especially from like the ages of 0 to 5, because those are core memories. So like foundational memories. And so, and there's so much of like 0 to 5 that most people don't remember. And I think that one really unique thing about me is that I have so many memories, that I do, like things that I recall that my mom will tell me, like, there's no way that you remember that. And I'll be like, I remember this. Like, I have this memory of this, and it might have been like a show we used to watch together in Spain. I remember my mom was watching like a show that, for all intents and purposes, might have been like inappropriate for a child to watch, but it involved like a sex worker who would round up men and choose like one man per night, to like shower with her affections, and then they would basically pay her. So it's like stuff like that where my mom was like, how do you remember, like, how do you remember that, like you were like 3 years old, so I know that I have like this differently abled body and like brain, and that I have these memories, and whereas my brother and my sister, um they're part of their coping mechanisms for a lot of like our lived experiences were really to forget. And so for me, um, I associate like open conversation with my grandfather. My grandfather was a very, I don't know how to describe him. You met him, so but for the audience, uh, he was constantly telling stories, and he liked to revisit the past a lot, because that's a part of how he built shared experience. So when I was with my grandfather, I was usually very open and very honest about everything that I was experiencing, and my grandfather was, but one of the things he would tell me is that he was always amazed uh, with the clarity of the way that I described my world and my experiences. And he's like, it's almost like you were like this full adult trapped in a child's body, from the time that you were able to speak. He said you would do such strange things. Like I would fall asleep and I would find you dragging a blanket to cover me, or things that like you didn't have a lot of context for, but you just knew what the right thing to do in those spaces were. So yeah, so like I think while you associate like quiet with good, like for me I associate it with like being shut down and being silenced.
Yeah, I don't remember very many conversations. Like I I should say that the few conversations that I can recall having with my parents, they were mostly with my father. Um, I remember like my dad explaining to me the concept of infinity while we were looking at the stars, or um, I remember having a conversation with him about what God is and things like that. And so those conversations mostly with my father. I don't remember. I don't remember having a lot of conversations with my mom about stuff, like about meaningful stuff. Like we talked. She was very much a daily check-in kind of lady. Like, how was your day? What did you do? I don't. And even my father was not a very talkative. Like we just don't. We have never had the sort of like we would sit at the dinner table, yeah, but we wouldn't have conversations.
I mean, that's like so crazy to me, because I spent like 2 years of my life like trying to parent. I remember like coming home to your dad, like, watching Theo, or like, and the moment I walked in, he would start in. And most days he wanted to talk about uh his childhood stuff. So I don't know what it is. Like I don't know if it's like because he was aging. I don't know if it was because like he knew that that was my trade, right? Like he's like, "Oh, you're a therapist. Let me unload this with you." And I'm just like, "Man, like my breasts are swollen and like hurting and I just want to feed the baby." Like just let me feed the baby. But it became like therapy o'clock for grandpa, and he would talk a lot about his feelings of rejection and abandonment, by he felt very rejected by his mom and very abused by his dad, and uh, and so it's interesting to me because it's like I feel like you missed out on this whole side of who your dad was. And even with your mom, like even though it was limited, I remember that we went to the grocery store because we were getting ready to do some shopping for your birthday. And that was what year? Like, how old were you turning that year? I think it was 20.
It
Were you turning
was
20?
2002, so I would have been turning 20.
Yeah, so you were turning 20 and I was up here for your birthday. And I was in my senior year of high school. And this was like my first time meeting I was so nervous.
I remember. We were at Sophia's house.
Yeah, I had met Sophie already, so I wasn't as nervous about her, but
And you had met... No, because you met my mom after my birthday. We went down and it was her birthday.
yes, I met her in September for her birthday.
So after
Yes.
my birthday, though, because mine is also in September.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, we had yours first, and so that was my first time meeting her, and I remember that we went to the grocery store together, and Sophie was Sophie, and she was like fairly quiet too, and but your mom started talking to me, and I guess at this point she knew that she knew how sick she was, and she probably had some inkling, some kind of idea that she may or she may not make it through it. And I remember her and in retrospect, like I had no idea why she was having this conversation with me, except that I knew that she knew I was a spiritual person. And so, she said, "I'm really worried about Paco." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, tell me about that." And like, she was like, "Well, Paco has always been afraid of death since he was a little boy." And then I was like, "Oh, okay." And I think you and I don't remember if you and I had those conversations at that point or not, but, and I was like, and so I was telling her, I was like, "Well, I don't think that we stop being present when we die. I think that there," and this is crazy because now I'm like tying that back to the ways that, I'm often like feel like I'm, we were just talking about my grandmother like this past week, and like just, what it looks like to receive messages from people who are no longer here, and like how so many people like can't connect to that idea of like our ancestors still being present in our lives, and in the ways that they show up, whether they show up through our dreams or in like intrusive, what feels like an intrusive memory or an intrusive thought, but they're here and they're like constantly sending us like guidance. And I told her, I said I don't think we cease to be, I don't think we cease to be here. And I remember she had some interesting thoughts about that. She told me something about how like she's always been like a deeply spiritual person too, and she was still kind of confused about what she believed, but like that she thought there was some truth to that. And so we connected on that. But she was very worried about you. And now like I'm like, "Oh, now I know why she now I know why. Thanks, Mom." And I remember her saying like, I'm glad that he has you, and I was like kind of like, we just met, so like we just met, so come on, like, so we're still in our first year of this relationship, so we'll see how it pans out.
It panned out. what are we defining as communication then? Because there's talking, and then there's nonverbal. Like, what are we talking about? What is communication?
Yeah, so I think it's all of it, but I know that probably feels like a cop out to say. So I wanna circle back to what you were talking about, like when you were discussing the idea of creating one sentence with a group of people, and I find it extremely frustrating to think that that it's become that difficult for us to collectively communicate because there was a point at which we did that fairly with ease, and so when I'm thinking about like oral histories, for example, right? Like there was a time that all we did was talk to each other. And when we had a disagreement or when we um needed the guidance of other people, we would come together as a community, and we would just have, and this is what I love, like the idea of circle processing. And I think that's in part why I've really embraced the like support group settings. Like I love the energy of and the work that gets done in support group settings. And there's like something really magical that happens between people when you're really frustrated and you're trying to grapple with something, and all of a sudden you see it and you're like, oh, we have this thing in common. This is not, I'm not alone in this. I'm not. And I think that we're all kind of reaching for that and having difficulty feeling like we truly have it. And so I think that's some of the difficulty with language, right? Because we're living in a very disconnected culture, a culture that is not a culture. Like there's no I mean, I struggle even to like say that, because there is an indigenous culture here. There are indigenous cultures here, but a lot of those are lost, and a lot of the people here aren't of those cultures. They're called, they come from like immigrants to this country, the original colonizers of this country, and that's really difficult, right? Because what was here was good. What was here had history, had knowledge, and when we talk about what is communication, what is language, um, we're losing a lot of that knowledge and a lot of that. And so it is easy to feel out of place because we don't have common traditions and common customs for how we do these things, right? And so a lot of us, like you and I, we come together from completely different upbringings, and even within our upbringings, we're already like super mixed, right? Like I'm like, we've got half white, you're talking about your mom, you know not really, your mom not really being like an affectionate person, and like, your dad on the opposite end being like a super physical first person but really struggling with language. And those things are actually true of both of my parents too, except like the opposite, right? So my dad was a super physical person, and the way that he liked to express himself was generally through very physical means. So an amazing dancer. He was actually a fairly good artist, and he liked having sex. That was who he was. Like he was amazing at those things, so was my grandmother was an amazing dancer. I don't know much about, like, they didn't talk very openly about sexuality, in that era, so it's hard to know, but she taught you met my grandmother. My grandmother embodied like joy and expression in the way that she dressed. She liked makeup, she liked loud colors, she liked animal print, she liked traveling, she liked food, oh my god, and she drank her Johnny Walker on the rocks, and she smoked. She was a like live life big kind of personality. And my mom's people, on the other hand, are very taciturn. they're people of little words, but they're hardworking. And I think some of it is like, there's some language differences there too, and some suppressed. Like I I talk a lot about like how the idea of like a Latinx culture is so reductionist because like it leaves so much of that complexity out, and I think America is that way too, right? Like we talk about white and we're like, okay, which white though? Like, but there is something inherent here that is like really toxic, and I don't know, I don't want to say like it's a cursed land here, but it's a little bit like when you come and you just slaughter and commit genocide, like that leaves a mark, right? And that's what's happened here. So like I don't think communication is only words, obviously. I think communication is we communicate things by, the gestures that we make, by the ways that we dress, by, like even like, in the last 2 weeks or so, like I've had a friend mention that our home, the outside of our home communicates a lot about who we are and what we're trying to do while we're here. And so like for people who don't know, like we just our front lawn has how many boxes now? Like
10.
10 10 raised beds, and we have a purple martin house that hangs like up high. We generally have like really loud and proud queer flags, like a flight in our front yard, and you know, uh, unapologetic Black Lives Matter signs, And so I mean, like I think part of the way that we want to walk in the world is by acknowledging both the white passing privilege that we have as light skinned folks, while also not erasing that we're both, mixed, and that mix includes both African and indigenous ancestries, and that we grew up hearing very negative messages, right, about that too. And so like there are so many ways that things are communicated, to us and for us, and like that we are now trying to communicate outwardly. And so, but in relationship, right? Because I think this is more focused on like how do you go about making that work for you in a relationship, and what are the strategies
Or maybe like, so we're talking about that, and obviously I think we're both good at talking, but sometimes the struggle is talking to each other or talking with each other, communicating clearly. So if we're considering all of the time that we've just spent, very quickly exploring our families of origin, and the sorts of communication that we learned, on one hand, how do we recognize those patterns, recognize the barriers that they present to us, take those moments of clarity and move past them, right? Because you and I are now 20 years into this.
uh-huh.
Obviously, that's still a work in progress, and it will always be a work in progress. I think it should be. How do those experiences become barriers? Maybe first, and then what can we do to? I'm asking you as expert, but also as partner. Like, how can we grow past that or through it?
Well, I mean, I've like the best example that I have is that and I think it's important that we be reciprocal in this, right? But I give you the example of my early inability to name needs, right? And so one piece of feedback that you gave me early on was that, you were like, well, I can't do that which I don't know you need. And so it was like a very quick lesson to me that if I needed or wanted something, that I had to communicate that pretty directly, and and yeah, I mean that's all there is to it. Like I had to be able to name it and tell you directly. Right, but then the other piece to that is that when you tell a partner, "Oh, well, if this is the issue, then here's the fix for it." And then they rise to meet you, then you have a duty to reciprocate and rise to meet them, right? In what it is that you've said that you can do on the other end. And so, but I feel like I've become very direct, and then when I became very direct, that became an issue. Because now I was too direct. And so it for women, I think it often is a lose-lose situation because we're both expected to be passive and meek in many respects. And when we grow into our power and sort of like take control and be like, okay, you know what? Like I'm in my 30s now and I think I can tell you that I need or want this and am more direct about that, then it becomes scary and an issue. And it's almost like it feels like we're always working in opposition.
Well, because it's as soon as you point out something that you need, it means that there's something that I as a partner wasn't doing, right? So I'm feeling criticized then.
Right.
And I get defensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then apparently your brain just shuts down.
True.
Thanks, Gottman, for that little piece of knowledge. Oh, God. Like that's, and I think, yeah, as you said, like you're asking me as a professional, right? So like I'm trying to keep up with
And
all
a partner.
these.
And a partner.
And a partner. I mean, it's both. Though it's like I don't always have all the answers, so I go seeking. Like okay, who's got this information? Who knows a little bit more than me? And like I'm good about finding like mentors and like sources. But like is the data helpful? Yeah, sure. I mean, it's helpful, but it's like, and that was what I learned. It's like I'm reading, what is it called, The Science of Trust by the Gottmans, and what they say is, oh yeah, like if you're dealing with like a person who is male-bodied, expect that any reactivity is going to cause them to basically shut down, and you need to take a break of like 20 minutes before they can re-engage. And it's like, seriously? Every time that I bring up something. So I think the fix to that is sort of like maybe something like, hey Paco, I want to have a conversation with you about this particular topic. We don't have
topic.
This topic, whatever the topic is.
Okay.
And immediately there's going to be anxiety and reactivity for you, and then like being like, I don't want to have that conversation today. Now you get to dread it for a week. Like, I mean, what is the fix to that? And we've tried, I mean, we can talk openly about this. Like, we had 3 different marital therapists.
Yeah, bad, and okay.
And okay.
And okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the third one was okay to a point.
Yeah.
And then we broke up with her.
Yeah, we had to.
Yeah.
And she did the best by us, like
Yeah.
that third one, and she came recommended.
Yeah, bad, and okay. Those are our marriage therapists. It's easy for me under the construct of this conversation because it's in the framework of a podcast to be able to talk about it. And full disclosure, Eva and I have had conversations about these conversations because as a framework as a podcast, it's artificial to a certain extent.
Yes.
And so we were on a road trip for spring break a couple weeks ago, and we spent 5-6 hours in the car together,
Mm-hmm.
in almost complete silence.
And I tried to make conversation several times.
So Eva's frustration is, what's the difference?
It's
Like,
not just what's the difference,
or
but it's
why
like,
do we need this
yeah, I don't want to
artifice?
have conversations that are mainly for display.
And I think that that's perfectly fair. And I think it was a meaningful moment for me to have that sort of realization of silence actually being a good thing. Because when we were discussing it, I my experience of that road trip when we were in silence was of peace, and I was calm, and we had a good trip. And so it's just interesting how we experience those things differently. Just as you're saying, reciprocating, we connect differently sometimes.
Yeah, and my experience was not that. My experience was like, okay, we've now had like, I think it was closer to like 8 hours, 8 hours in the car. It was about the same difference as from here to Miami. But heading into North Carolina, and it's like we don't have this much time together ever, and both kids are, they get really tired in the car, and one of them gets car sick every single time. So we're Dramamine is a must at this point, and so I'm like, oh my god, the kids are quiet. They're not, you know, not listening, and like we could be engaging in like a conversation about like what what dreams do we want to grow, what how do we want to what new directions may we want to head in the next couple years, and nothing. It was silence. Yeah, and I think my comment to you was like, I don't want to just have conversations with you because you're recording it for your podcast.
Yeah.
But here we are. So so I think something's got to give. We have to be able to have, and we have not, we've been falling off a little bit in the recent days, but we usually have like these we call them coffee dates, usually on Sunday mornings, where we just sit on the porch, and I'm okay with those being relatively quiet because usually what we're doing is we're contemplating like nature in our front yard. um
Before this, we were upstairs and we were cleaning after dinner, and we had a extended conversation.
yep.
And so it happens.
But see, it's easier when the conversation is about maybe another individual, or you know particularly like as parents, right, if the conversation is about our children, or if the conversation is about a close friend, like those conversations are often a lot easier for you, I think, than when the conversation centers around us.
Well, tell me why.
I have to have these answers.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Yeah, they can be challenging, and I guess it's not that I don't enjoy talking or having the conversations. I don't know. And as I'm thinking about stories, like, I think sometimes I struggle to find what the story is, and I think that makes, I think part of the problem, a huge part of the problem, is, in light of struggles that we have had in our relationship over the past few years. I think that as relationships continue over extended periods of time, they get easier, but they also get more complex, because you know the person better and you know the person more, and you're able to read the person fairly clearly. But also, I think it's good, a sign of a good relationship over an extended period of time is that the relationship does become more complex, because
Mhm.
at first there is the new relationship energy and everything is about the other person, and then over time that changes, and it should change. And it's not, I think a lot of anxiety, especially in monogamous relationships, is that we interpret that change as a growing apart from one another. And that's not what it is. It's a natural response to the truth that we can't be all things to each other all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think that something that was a struggle for me and always will be a struggle for me is the desire to be able to not be all things all the time, but to be the thing when it's needed. And part of that is because communication is so necessary and so important. I do have, I want to make sure that that the things that I say are meaningful and truthful. But
Uh-huh.
because I'm so worried about that, it becomes hard as opposed to natural. And I just remember when our relationship was much younger, we would everything was a story. And I think that that's something that I probably should try to find again, is the ability to, because it's our story. It's the story that
Mm-hmm.
we're making together. And so as opposed to like how am I feeling, or how am I doing, or what's going on, it's what happened today that will extend or grow or nurture our relationship, or what came up today that was a challenge or forces me to reevaluate something about what's going on. And so I think that it's mostly a perspective shift, because when the things that you often describe as being the aspects of our relationship that require work, for me, those are the things that cause anxiety. Those are the things that
Mm-hmm.
um, don't come naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And so I instead of letting it flow or letting it breathe or letting stories tumble out of us, I think that I fight against myself a lot of the time, because I am often scared. My mom was right that I've always been a very scared person, not just of death. I'm scared of everything. But I'm also a very controlled person, or at least I try to be, as a reaction or as a coping mechanism for those fears. And so as opposed to finding a healthy way of just letting the things come out, I try to stack them in a way that is concise and clear, including how I communicate. And that's fine sometimes. But for meaningful communication, especially between partners, I think it's unnatural. I find myself struggling because I try to do something that is unnatural, which is to treat the language as I don't even know. I become very much over concerned about how you're hearing me rather than what it is that I want to say, or what it is that I'm feeling.
Yeah, and I don't know what the fix to that is, because I think it's different for everyone. Like, I think for me it was just being able to say the stuff really honestly, and now it's a weird floodgate, right, to open, because you you spend so much time not being able to say what it is that you've experienced or who you are, and then you start to, and then you realize that you become really unapologetic about it, and then the world squashes you back down again. And it's like you take 3 steps forward, and then like you're like, oh man, I gotta take 5 back now again. And so it's like you can only do it in doses, but it's like a place where that's supposed to be really safe is in your relation, in your, or you think, right? You grew up with this idea that like the your life partner is supposed to be like a person who can hold all of that, no matter what it looks like. And I think that we're just kind of force fed these like really unrealistic realities of what that looks like. Particularly, and I want to say particularly femme folks, because mask folks don't come equipped to deal with a lot of that. And so then, you take on, I think for a long time, like you feel the need to take on the emotion work of that. And then you realize that you're so exhausted because you never really agreed to take on that work in addition to your own work, in addition to the emotional work of kids, and like have a career. And for some of like so many of us who are sitting at these intersections of like, I don't know so much that I decided to have a career as that I needed to by economic, and I'm talking about economic need, right? Like we needed to have a dual earner household. And I remember my mom speaking to that too. I remember me asking my mom at one point, like, hey mom, what happened? Like, why didn't you uh, stay home to raise us? And my mom was like, very matter of fact, like, that wasn't an option for me. And yet so much of her frustration in the ways that I experienced her as very cold, as a very cold individual, and particularly when I perceived her parent as being so warm, uh, because he was a very warm person. And that didn't make sense to me, that you could be raised by somebody who was so warm but yet be so cold to your own kids. And and I think that what I maybe wasn't balancing out well there was that, my grandfather likely had a lot of privilege as a man, right? And didn't have to do a lot of the holding and emotional work, at least not until he was older, after his wife passed, and then he had to do a fair amount of it for himself. And even then I think he struggled with that a bit, right? Like he was pretty set in his own ways, and he never remarried either. Like you talked about your dad, um, like having a couple of relationships after your mom, but never really remarrying. And my grandfather likewise uh did not want to do that. I don't think it was so much that he didn't want to do it as like um he was uncompromising and didn't want to have to do the emotional work that it required to have another partner, you know? And so I think about that. I think about like what it takes to really welcome somebody, like to welcome different people into our lives as we grow. Because it gets harder. And that's not just for people who are, you know, not partnered or non-monogamous, but it's like for people who are just trying to make friends as they get older. And that's been a real struggle for me, is like how to build meaningful friendships as I age, because I feel like I need those. I need to have people who are outside of my family circle, of my romantic circle, like to really give me perspective on life, to kind of feel like my creativity. And I think it was Avni. Like Avni is really wonderful in the way that she views like friendships. She says that, or she has said, and maybe she's changed her mind since then because she's had a kid. Um, but one of the things I remember her saying is that she thought that friendship was the purest form of love. And then I've heard other women say things like Wendy, for example. I want to really credit her for this, but I remember one day telling me that she felt like, people used to talk about the concept of true love as if like it was usually like a partner, right? Like the true love. And she's like, I didn't really understand true love until I had kids. And then I understood it. And I was like, okay, cool. And I think as a non-parent, like I had a concept of what she meant. And then I had kids, and then I was like, oh my God, if somebody hurts these kids, I'm gonna, I mean, like, I'm gonna hurt someone. Like, I will hurt someone if they hurt my kids, and there's something about that. There's something about, you know, understanding that about myself, understanding that about like that sometimes people can communicate certain things to you, but until you've lived it or experienced it, you're not really actually gonna get it. And then some of that is also identity based. Some of us know that we're certain things, and some of us know that we're not. And so I think that's where we get to the place of like, how do we embrace when people tell us something that isn't part of our lived experience, can never be a part of our lived experience. But if we really love and care about this person, we need to find a way to integrate it into our knowledge base so that we can respond in a way that embraces, validates, and holds space for that reality. And most people just don't care. They just don't care enough to do that. And so communication for me is a constantly, how do I say this? It's like, it's just, there's a lot of disappointment involved. And so you have to grow a really thick skin around the embracing of like the imperfection of communication. And it's not just the imperfection of communication, but the imperfection of freaking humanity. Like that there are things that I want to express so badly to other people, but it's not really that I want to express it to them. I want them to feel it with me, and they can't. And sometimes, I internalize that as like my own failure. I internalize that as a failure in my ability to communicate to other people something clearly enough that they can experience it. Sometimes I tell someone something and I've said it as clearly and as articulately as I can, and I look at them and I can tell that the light behind their eyes isn't sparkly, for lack of better words. Like, I can tell that it hasn't, the words have not flowed into them in a way that makes me see their spirit like shining back at me. That's the best way I can explain it in English. That like I'm not seeing my words reflected back to me, and those are heartbreaking moments.
Thank you for listening to this first segment of our conversation about communication. Please look out for the next segment soon. If you have comments or questions about anything we discussed, please send a message to finloslives@gmail.com or via social media.